So today we're building the Reaver Vandal. If you guys bought my file, thank you so much. I'm gonna do my best as feedback comes in. Any changes, any problems you guys have, just let me know. We're gonna talk about electronics, go through the whole build, all the hardware, everything like that, so that you can have the easiest possible building experience. We'll start out with the front end of the barrel. This clear part slides in through here and snaps into place. And the barrels themselves interlock just like that. These printed as transparent, but if you're gonna do the LEDs, I recommend printing them in some opaque material. I recommend using something like an epoxy putty to install them. Last piece goes like this, and it's the same on the other side. Next, I'll look at the stock. This has a cutout for a very specific charger board. There's also a version if you want to just put some batteries in here that does not have this cutout. This is the lens, so to speak. It slides in just like this, and there's an indentation on the inside where it sits. And if you're using like a white filament that is kind of translucent, you would probably want to spray the inside with some black spray paint just to avoid any kind of light leaks. Once these two are installed, this just slides into place. You can use just about any screw, doesn't have to be, you could use an 1/8 inch rod to lock this in place. Here's the magazine. This slides into the back. Should have a very tight fit. This one doesn't have the supports removed yet, but they go like this. So this is stationary and it just slides right in there. Here's the main body. This, of course, just goes together like this. The handle slides in like that. The stock slides in like this. The front assembly slides in just like this. There's two versions of this sight. This version is from the game files. It does not have the ability to hold the red dot sight, but it does have these spike details. This is the one I used. The top piece here just slides, and this whole unit gets glued to the top. Ejection port cover, which should just fall right into place. So I just rough cut this 1/2 inch acrylic tube to 16 inches. I'm gonna slide this through. And right here we have our wire path for the LEDs for this lens. This is about 6 inches long. It's gonna slide in like that and leave us with just enough room for these wires. If you're not doing the LED version, I would definitely have an aluminum rod going all the way through. The trigger sits in here. We're using an 1/8 inch rod to hold it in place. When you glue these two halves together, you might have to drill it out. Lastly, we have these little LED lenses. These slide in just like this. You can install these right away. This hanging here is actually very delicate. If you sand these flush, when you spray your primers or whatever on top of it, you can just sand it away, or you can just mask it. With all of the clear parts that are going to be used to diffuse light, like this one, you really don't have to sand it too much. You want the back to maybe be at like 220 grit, so it diffuses light really well. Just cut these two 1/8 inch rods in here, line it up with these holes. When we sandwich it together, this won't be able to move. It might jiggle a little bit. You might need to put a little bit of epoxy putty down in there. It'll keep the wiring from getting pulled in any kind of way. This lever takes about an inch long 1/8 inch rod that just goes like that. There's a ton of different ways to do the LEDs. In all of the clear components, there's many places you could mount any kind of LEDs, but for this project I chose to use WS2812B LED strips. These are directional. We're going to use about 2 feet of them split into a couple different segments. In the front of the gun, this LED strip, we're going to cut off all of that, would sit right here on this back side. So the acrylic rod is going to serve a dual purpose of providing rigidity but also diffusing the light. The LED strip is going to come out on top of it, wrap around the rod, and then come into this wire path. The wires are going to go through the wire path and down into here where we can start our next strip of LEDs. These are going to wrap around our lens, and we're going to be careful not to crimp these too much in the corners. We'll cut it right here and then extend wires up and over and into the top over here. Over here we only need like 2 or 3 lights. You can mount them down here on this surface, or if you put a little bit of epoxy putty around the top here, you can stick them directly centered at the top. The wires then have to come out of this top area down back into our wire path and come into the stock. Inside the stock, we can put a strip of LEDs down the center here. It doesn't have to be that much, maybe 6 LEDs from here to here. One of the features I like to design in is to have the trigger actually do something. So in this case, we're going to use a really small push button switch to control our LED system. Once the 2 halves are glued together, the switch is going to go with 2 wires to the battery. The switch gets mounted right here. This is a little bit undersized, but when you push back on the trigger, it'll hit the push button. So to control our WS2812Bs, we need a LED controller. These are some of the smallest ones that I found, and they're pretty cheap, and that's how I did the RGX blade. This is how they usually come. You can cut off this insulation if you want to. On this one, it doesn't really matter. You can just use it. This one has the buttons located inside. There's Bluetooth ones. This one has a remote control. Here's our charger board and our battery. Now, you're not really supposed to fire these up when they're wound up like this, but this is almost 6 feet, and we want to get a rough estimate of how much power it's going to take. We're running this at 5 volts exactly. That whole thing is taking about 0.87 amps. Doesn't seem like anything is getting above 0.9 amps at 5 volts. Here's a closer look at our charger board. This USB-C is the input for charging, and this is a USB output. Additional output is this 5-volt rail. These 2, negative and positive, go to the battery, and there's an additional terminal here, K, which when you connect that to one of the 5-volt, I forget which one exactly, it'll control it with a double click or a single click. I really don't like that system. I'd much rather just connect a switch to either side of the battery cables. When plugged in like this, the board will boot up. This is a charge indicator. The only other important thing to note about these particular boards and the WS2812, whatever, individually addressable LEDs, is that they always have these 3, voltage, signal, and ground. Your voltage and ground are both connected directly to the power supply. So the 2 wires coming from this guy go straight to those wires. Each unit will feed data to the next one, and you can't interrupt that process. You can wire these in parallel, which makes it much easier for packaging, but the animations aren't going to flow from one to the next like they would if they were all in sequence. They're infinitely adjustable. They do have memory, although I think it might wipe after a certain amount of time. You can control brightness and speed, solid colors. There's even some kind of calibration functions. And that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, please post them in the comments. A couple people were asking about a similar kind of video for the Arcane Sheriff, so that's coming next.